Tell us about the work you did at Ball State.
Being at Ball State was a very interesting experience for me. It was the first and certainly thus far only time I've worked in an academic environment in any capacity. Um, it was obviously very different from a conventional commercial research entity, but in effect we were working in a very similar way to a research firm, but within an academic institution. Of course, there were a lot of very fundamental differences to how we were funded, how we were able to use our funding, and so on, and quite rightly so. But it was a great opportunity to combine academic rigour that was provided by a range of colleagues at the university with an understanding of the commercial landscape, commercial needs and necessities of people on the outside, the companies on the outside that Ball State wanted to engage with, which is why they brought me on board. Really, with a $20 million grant, you basically have an awful lot of resource with which to play. And even better, the criteria for success aren't that you necessarily achieve the goals of the project. The real criteria for success are that if you fail, you understand why you fail. And somebody, of course, somewhere will write up a learned academic article out of it. But that amount of resource was great. Of course, then when we got a second $20 million grant, that was even better for the university. And I didn't get all my hands on all of that, obviously. But it set up a platform where we were able to do innovative research that we deliberately designed to be both academically relevant and interesting, but also relevant to industry. The observational research that we did, large-scale systematic observations where we tracked people's behaviour through direct observation in person in 10-second increments of time. And in fact, in one project, 5-second increments of time. That work was all but unique. Nobody else was doing it at the time, and today nobody is doing it anywhere. But it gave us the opportunity to really objectively understand in great detail the ebbs and the flows of media use in the context of people's daily lives as they went about doing whatever it was they did. And it certainly put Ball State on the map as a media research entity. I had a great deal of fun doing it, and it gave me the opportunity to interact with frankly, through some of the best minds in the media research business in the States at the time. Whether it was working with individual companies like ESPN or with the Council for Research Excellence, for whom we obviously did the video consumer mapping project in partnership with Sequent partners. Jim Spaeth and Bill Malt worked very closely on that project with us.
The Ball State research lasted, I guess, around 5 years or so. From when you first started monitoring consumer behavior to the time at which you completed the project, did you see any change, any evolution or dramatic change?
I think what was really interesting in what I think must have been the 7 or 8 years that the observational research spanned, most of the significant changes were driven by changes in the media landscape itself, the advent of new devices, for example. I remember the first project we ever did when we did the Middletown media studies, where we also did diary studies, and we also did next day recall to calibrate basically the disparity of self-reported data versus observational. One of the media that we included then for the first time was the cell phone. And a lot of people said to us, why on earth are you including the cell phone? That doesn't make any sense at all. Of course, this was before the advent of the smartphone. And then when we did it again the next year, well, you started to see more smartphones coming through. And people started to understand why it was important to cast a very, very broad net indeed at that time. And we all know what's happened with the cell phone, and then of course the tablets come through. If we were doing it now, we would start to see more connected TVs, for example, coming through. We also saw at the time more laptops becoming more prevalent, and therefore that impacting the way in which people use the computer. People coming out of the home office or the den or the kitchen or wherever the desktop had previously been, and using the laptop in the family room while watching TV with the family and getting what they defined as quality time, even though they were still largely ignoring their fellow members of the family. They happened to be in the same room. And I think the increase in the breadth and the richness of quality of the media experience on a mobile environment. As laptops had better battery life, better processing power, they could become better able to stream video or so forth when out and about if you're in a Wi-Fi hotspot, as well as tablets and so on. Those were the kinds of changes we saw. Fundamentally, I don't think we saw changes in how people related to media. They happen over a much, much longer period of time.
You mentioned including cell phones in the Ball State study before it really became a factor in people's behavior. If research is considered part art and part science, how do you blend that together? Where do you get your inspiration to include things that may not immediately make sense to include?
I think the best research is more often than not alchemy than it is wholly scientific or wholly artistic. It's obviously very rarely wholly artistic. It's an innately creative endeavor at its very best. Obviously, it has to be scientifically robust. You've got to be able to rely on the data. And at the end of the day, competitive advantage does not come from data alone. I don't care how big your data set, I don't care how good your data set is. It's inevitably, it's like an artist. It's whatever you create with the insights that you can derive from the data that you have, whether that's quantitative data, whether it's qualitative or a mix of both more often. It's how creative you're able to be with that, how insightful your team can be, what is the risk threshold you're most comfortable with. If you're not comfortable with any risk at all, you better be very comfortable with being in the middle of the pack, which is a perfectly decent place to be if that's your strategy. But the research which I think enables people to gain competitive advantage and stand out is, of course, that which does not wholly follow the norms, the prescribed path. And you referred to the example of including cell phones in our work in the early days of Ball State. I think that was obviously majorly informed by the fact that I'd come over from the UK, where cell phones at that time were more developed as a medium, and I'd been doing research with cell phones as one of the handful of interactive media that were prevalent at the time. Obviously, it was relatively stone age to what we look at now, but nonetheless it was there and people were spending research money around the platform. But I love, quite frankly, to indulge that creative side of the business by trying to join the dots. I love looking at issues, at challenges, at problems from multiple perspectives, and it's quite possibly a form of psychological imbalance, I don't know, but I find it impossible to look at something just from one angle. And I always want to know what lies behind something or what the other viewpoint might be. And sometimes that means that you just add some small element into your plan around a piece of research. Or sometimes it doesn't even surface until you're working with your colleagues on the analysis and there's an apparent anomaly. And you start to dig into that anomaly and you realize that actually, no, let's give this a bit more time. It's not an anomaly. If we actually correlate that with another piece of data or with another insight, we realize there's a consistent pattern emerging. And it's joining dots that aren't obviously joinable that I find so incredibly stimulating about this business, particularly because it is so immersed in human behavior. And humans are far from rational. We have these great business plans, we have this technology, and all of these things paint a picture and a very linear path of how things will work. The dot-com sort of explosion was a great example of that. We'll make this happen, it's easier, therefore people will do it. Well, surprise, surprise, a great many people carried on doing things the old ways. We're humans. We're irrational beings. A lot of us don't like change. We certainly don't like it at any alarming pace. It doesn't matter if you say it's easier. I like the way I've done things. Thank you. Inertia is a very, very powerful beast. I love understanding the irrationality of humans. And I don't personally have a view that you better do it using one method or another. I love being able to blend an array of different methods into a research architecture that's robust and efficient, but which is nonetheless rich and allows for creative exploration once you've gathered all the parts together.